In the world of popular music and culture, in terms of longevity, daring, breadth, and diversity of projects, he has few peers. From being the frontman for legendary new wave band and video pioneers Devo, to a prolific film and TV composer whose credits include Thor Ragnarok, the Royal Tenenbaums, Pitch Perfect 2, Happy Gilmore, and the Lego Movie, Mark Mothersbaugh has left his own unique imprint on the world of audio and video media. Hello, I'm your host, Paul Teese, and on this episode, I had the privilege of sitting down with Mark to discuss his singular career, which has spanned 5 decades. We discussed the musical influences and visual aspects of his groundbreaking band, his thoughts on the creative process from both a collaborative and solo viewpoint, the role that technology has played over time in his work, and the transition he made from rock legend to celebrated film composer. Well, Mark, thank you so much for joining me today. I know you're super busy, and as you mentioned just right before we started, you've got a big party for Devo scheduled there at your studio tomorrow. I can't believe it's been like about 50 years, I think, really, since Devo got started in Akron, and the early days, I would say, and I think you've said this in some interviews before, but that you mentioned that Devo really started more as an art project than as a rock band, or it seemed like that was kind of the intent. It was much more than just a rock band, but like really it was an art project and really kind of a social commentary project. And you mentioned that the early 20th century Dadaists as influences, but were there other artists or innovators who've been particularly influential on you then when you got started, and then also now as a composer in film?
Well, yeah, lots of people. Yeah, I learned about the Dadaists at school at Kent State, and I kind of thought if I could ever live in another time, it would be in the 20s and 30s, in Europe, because I loved all of those art movements that had manifestos. I really liked that. I thought that was great, and there were different groups that had different things they concentrated on. I think even through the years, upwards and even backwards, though, it's people like Eno was an influence for me personally, because I was looking for ways to create sounds that reflected what was going on in our culture and that were relevant to what was happening in the world. And I was using synthesizers. I was doing things like Sun Ra, like playing them like this, so I could get explosions and caveman sounds, and also futuristic ray guns, and but then also Vietnam V2 rockets, mortar blasts and explosions and things like that, and also just kind of paying attention to commercials and listening to some of the silly sounds they had, or some of the different things where you go, what's that, and so. Yeah, a lot of people influenced us. Captain Beefheart influenced Jerry and Bob and me quite a bit. Jerry was coming at it from more like a blues background. He was in a blues band when we first met. And I was looking at Beefheart as this guy who was doing this beatnik poetry, over top of very interesting sounds and music that were definitely like, I thought, okay, well, this rock and roll is going to be over now after, Zappa and Beefheart and all these other people I was hearing that I thought were, really making big changes. The Italian futurists were an influence. What really kind of made me think I need to come up with new sounds for this time, because they were like, even in the 20s, 30s, they were saying the contemporary orchestra does not have the sounds required to like properly make music for an industrial society. And so they were adding in like electric fans with a like a playing card, make it so it go bzzz, and they were using fog horns, and they were using atypical instruments, and I love that. And I thought, yeah, and in my culture, we've got technology now. So we have synthesizers, and it just really made me think about it that way. Ballet Mécanique, I think, had a big influence on Devo because of their geometric outfits and the shapes of things. Bob Mothersbaugh found a picture in a little Lulu comic of a space alien, and he was wearing a cancellator helmet. And it was basically a Devo hat with ear flaps. And I kept drawing it through the years. I used to draw pictures of Devo on stage in kind of very geometric shaped outfits. And at the same time, Jerry was working at a janitorial supply company where he was helping them put their catalog together. And so he was seeing all these things like hazmat outfits that you could buy for like $3.85 a piece.
Mm-hmm.
So we were looking at all that, and I was drawing pictures of like a Devo with that red hat on it years before we actually made them. So those were all kind of influences. I still have if there was a time period I could go back to and be a part of, it would be Europe between World War I and World War II, the art scene there.
So, a couple of thoughts there. One, you listen to the music. It's actually pretty complex stuff, and obviously, you guys really blew up in the punk and new wave scene, and there was so much emphasis on simplicity. But like I was listening the other day, I was listening to Timing X off of Duty Into the Future, and I'm like, the time signatures are just insane. And I'm like, and you mentioned Frank Zappa. I was like, this could be something that Frank Zappa would have played, just that's just a crazy time signature and the constant changes. And so it's like, I think that especially now when you go back and listen to your catalog, at least I have a greater appreciation of the complexity and how forward thinking the music was, in the context of like a quote unquote pop song. But then also, the visuals, right? And you guys were so daring with your visual identity at a time. It was like ripped jeans and, maybe in safety pins was like the really pushing it, of course. But you guys took things to an entirely different level with the costumes and the videos. How did that develop? And, what informed that creative process? And, I know Jerry, for instance, is a video director, but like, were all the guys on board with doing the outfits and things, or were there any where people are like, what, you want me to dress like a potato?
There was none of that. Bob Mothersbaugh he was the first one of us to direct a film. He wrote and directed a short in high school. And it was Chuck Statler who came and visited us in, I think it was the winter of 74, I think it was. And he had a copy of Popular Science, and on the cover was this young couple, and they've got this silver 12-inch, what looks like an LP, but it's silver, like if you got a platinum album or something. But and they're like happy, and they're going like they're dancing or something. And it says laser discs. Everybody will have one by next Christmas. And we were like, laser discs, and we started reading about it, and we thought, what a great idea. What if 45s had visual and sound? If it was, we love that idea of sound and vision, both on one disc, right? And the same with an album. And so we actually thought we were designing material that would end up being on laser discs, when we came out. Of course, laser discs, for whatever reason, it's not important at this point why they broke down, but we still kept making films. And we had art backgrounds. Chuck Statler directed our first film. He said recently, well, I'll tell you, I remember Jerry saying, I don't understand what Mark's trying to do with these crazy sounds. And so I thought, well, I better record what they're doing now, because it probably won't be here next year. So he said that's what but it was my two brothers, and Jerry and I were the original Devo. And my brother Jim, he was our first drummer, and he probably invented one of the very first electronic drum kits ever. And he went on to like circuit bending, a lot of our gear, a lot of my stuff, a lot of, like the synths and things. He fiddled with them, so they weren't just, off the rack synthesizers. He made them do things that they wouldn't have done. When I asked him, I told him what kind of sounds I was looking for, and he was really into that. And the band back then, that was probably the most pure art that we were in our whole history of Devo. In the early days. And it was like, we imagined being the 1975 version of cabaret in like Vienna or France back in the 20s.
Now, I've got a couple of audience submitted questions. So this first one comes from Brian Burkhart of Oakland, California. And Brian writes, I read somewhere that Devo was the first to use MIDI in a live performance. Is that true? What were your creative and technical challenges and how did you work through them?
Okay. You know what he's referring to is in 1981, we were like, man, everybody's copying us. They're all doing films and they're terrible. They're calling them promo videos and they're terrible. What do we do to stay a step ahead? And we decided, Jerry and I said, you know what? We're going to do live films with our songs and we're going to be in them on stage. We decided in 1981, we made a stage, we designed a stage that was 10 feet deep and only had spots coming from above our head. And right behind us was I think it was like 25 by 50 foot screen that we put rear projected 35 millimeter film on it. And there was no such thing as MIDI yet in 81. It wasn't worked out yet. Other people like Laurie Anderson and Michael Jackson and David Bowie had all kind of like run films while they were on stage. It was always soft. We played to a click that was an audio click that Alan had to count perfectly or we would have been screwed up for the whole song. And he did. He was like a little mechanical timekeeper. He was awesome. We'd play to a click so that if I'm singing about Out of Sync and and there's robot girls dancing, there's robots dancing on behind me and they're all in the same movement, but one of them's out of sync dancing where I could just point backwards with my hand and go boom, like I was shooting a ray gun or something. And we'd play a synth on stage and went whoosh. And because Alan had counted everything perfect, every night the robot exploded perfectly in time. We had a song called Speed Racer where a doctor, a girl, and a pirate all come out on stage and sing 15 feet tall. They just wander out on stage behind us and they sing totally in sync with Devo with the song. And so we had their voices pre-recorded and they could just do their voice, to that. And, like the pirate at one point, he's chasing us around the stage and he starts kicking us and we would just fall over and it worked really great. It's like from a big concert hall, it looked pretty good to see us reacting to that and people loved it. It was, and that's what he was referring to. But but you get confused with MIDI because my brother Jim, at that point, he was no longer the drummer. He was so obsessed with electronics and things. He went over and he started working with Roland synthesizers. And he was part of there was a group of technicians from all the different music equipment manufacturing companies in those days that all came together and developed MIDI and came up with the protocol and what MIDI was going to be and what sacrifices to make and what things to hold on to. And so sometimes that gets talked about and at the same time. And so that could be why he said MIDI.
Wow, that's pretty awesome. And it's so cutting edge, and again, I think over time now, because of how amped up technology is, we kind of forget, in a predominantly analog world, stuff like that was just so groundbreaking and it's kind of mind blowing. I mean, it's still really cool, of course, but I think people maybe lose some appreciation for like the hoops you guys would have to jump through to pull something like that off in 1981.
MIDI and things like MIDI radically changed popular music and what it sounded like, because all of a sudden you could connect all these. It wasn't like you were crawling around on the floor plugging in analog modular synths together to get a sound. It was like all of a sudden it was very easy. You could use one keyboard. You could be playing 5 different synths, 10 different synths, 127 actually, to if you wanted to. It was a very amazing tool to come up for artists and everybody loved it.
Oh, that's awesome. Now with Devo, as a band, it was a collaborative creative process, whereas in soundtrack composition, it seems like I'm assuming you're much more, it's a solo contributor type of role. Now, that may be oversimplifying things, and I won't pretend to know everything that goes into scoring a film, but can you talk to the different dynamics and speak to the pros and cons of each, collaborative versus solo composition, the pros and cons of each in terms of creative exploration?
Yeah. I write a lot of music for me, and I never play it for people. I play it for myself. And it's like something I want to listen to while I'm just hanging out at home, and I'll write my own music. But with Devo, we were two sets of brothers from the beginning. It's like when my brother left, Bob Casale and Alan Myers came in. So there were two Casales, two Mothersbaugh still. And we were used to collaborating. And, we were worried about people in the band, like I wrote the most music in the band. And rather than have it where people were like, like when you watch the Beatles thing and you see, all the bitterness between George Harrison and the other guys because he didn't get to contribute. We decided early on we're going to split the publishing 5 ways so that it would give everybody, like a reason to want to collaborate and to want to give input. So like, even though songs might say, well, Mark Mothersbaugh wrote the music and the words, or, maybe Jerry wrote the words and I wrote the music or whatever, the reality was everybody was working to help make that song work. And they were rewarded by getting, 1/5 of the publishing, which was really good for us. So I always liked that. And that made it actually easier for me to be a composer because, on almost every project you work on, it's the most common thing is a director shows up. And usually the director is the one who has been pioneering this project, or he's been the person that's been trying to get this done for like, it might have been 5 years between the time he first read the script or decided I want to make this movie to the time that they come to me and say, okay, we've got a rough cut to show you, or okay, we've got a script you can read. So there's still, collaboration. And so I just feel really comfortable with it because I'm used to working that way. And for me, it's interesting to listen to people talk because music is so abstract to talk about, if you're trying to give somebody direction, like what to write, it's like, you're like, oh, he's done 20 films already. This is my first one. How do I tell him what to do or what I want? And, it's like, I'm so used to people just saying, make this, sadder, make this happier, make sure that, you focus on this character in it, or, it changes between two people. And so you write themes and you write music so that you guys can collaborate. And for me, I love that job. I find it intriguing. Actually, what I really love more and more all the time is writing music for games. And I'll tell you why. With video games, it's a whole different process because, you're writing music for these different levels. And unlike a film where you watch it one time through and you may never see that film again, you may have only seen Thor Ragnarok once. Maybe you see it a second time, you watch it on TV again and remember it. But a lot of times people only see a film once, where a game, especially the first level, a game player is going to hear that music 1,000 times, maybe. Who knows how many times they're going to play the game. And the first time they hear it, it might take them 20 minutes to get through that first level. So you want to make the music in that level really great and something that you would want to listen to for 20 minutes too, or longer. And, of course, then it also has to be plastic or flexible so that, by the 20th time they play the game, maybe they're only there for like 30 seconds before they bop onto the next couple levels, and then they get to the new challenging one. And then there's something in the way that you listen to the music for a video game that is more like writing music than any other medium, I think. And what that is because, Ratchet and Clank or whatever, and they're doing something on whatever planet they're on. And it starts off very simple. And maybe it's just like one instrument, one tone, and it's like quarter notes or half notes, even slow. And then it's slowly building. And then maybe what happens is in that, he finds something that he was looking for in it, and it gives him more power. And then you bring in the woodwind section, and they're playing something, a counterpoint to the first piece of music. And it's much more like writing. It's like, when you write a song, you can't play all the instruments at once, especially orchestral. You can't play 100 instruments at one time. And so you're putting them on one at a time. And so people that are playing that game, they experience the music kind of more similar to the way a composer writes music than in pop songs, for sure, where you just hear the finished piece, and then you get later on, maybe there's some remixes, and it gives you ideas of breakdowns and stuff of the song that give you clues into the song and how it got to where it was and what the intentions are. And then as each of these instruments add up, finally you get to the end of all the instruments, and maybe the first time you heard them all, it took 30 minutes to get to hear the whole song. Then you start over on another level with, one instrument, and it's probably a different instrument. You're doing a whole different, depending on like Ratchet and Clank, we were going to different planets. So, we looked for different, like a totally different feel for different planets. And so I really I love games, writing music for games, to be honest with you.
Now, our next audience question comes from Vince Milewski of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And Vince writes, Devo was definitely groundbreaking in their approach to music. Since creativity always seems to inspire criticism, how did the band keep focused on their style of music in a culture that was not always accepting of it?
I remember at first, like our first review in Rolling Stone magazine, we got attacked because there's even a song in there that doesn't have a guitar. And they were really pissed off about that. We're like, oh, I thought they would love it, that we were doing something totally new. And, after, our first setup, it was interesting because, in Europe, it was totally different. We Sounds, Melody Maker, and NME, New Music Express, they came out every week in England, which was really cool. Big fat magazines, all about music. But they had this style where it was a build them up, knock them down. So their first interviews were great. And like we were on the cover of Melody Maker with David Bowie's head in the corner. In that cover, Bowie said, "This is the band of the future." And that was a pretty good thing to have, the first time you're on the cover of a big music magazine in London. But then, a couple months later came the knock them down part, because they need to keep talking, and so because they have to fill up these 3 big magazines every week. And so it was a lot of good stuff. And we charted in like at least half a dozen countries in Europe with the first album. Uncontrollable Urge was #1 in Yugoslavia. Satisfaction was in the top 10 in England. And because of that, we got to play on the Old Grey Whistle Test. And they still didn't know who we were in the US, except at like K-Rock on both coasts. And college radio played Devo, but we were not on real radio until with it.
Wow. So, as we kind of start looking at, a little bit more at your film composition aspects of your career, was there a learning curve when you started composing for film? What have you learned from that over time as far as like film composition and, working with orchestras and trying to like bring a director's vision to life through music and stuff? What did you have to learn to kind of get there?
Oh, a lot of things. I mean, when I did Pee-wee's Playhouse, they were filming it in New York, and they were doing the edits and their mixes over there. So I just got a rough tape, and then I wrote music for all the parts and sent it back. And it wasn't until the end of the first season, I think there were like, in those days, there was like 13 episodes would create a season. And I just remember I talked to the picture editor that was putting the whole show together at the end. Once he had all the sound effects and all the pictures and all the music and all the dialogue, and he goes, I always had a question I wanted to ask you, Mark. Why did every cue come to me with leader in between it. How come you didn't use time codes so that you could play, in total sync with the picture? And I remember saying, "What's time code?" And I hadn't gone to school for music. I think anybody that wants to get into composing, you could save yourself a couple of years of trial and error if you go to music school first.
Mm-hmm. Are there any musical artists you would have liked to perform with?
Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, there's things that at the time I thought, oh, I don't want to work with them. After one of our shows in LA, this guy named Burt Bacharach took us over to his mansion,
Mm-hmm.
Late at night, and we're in there, and I'm like, wow, this looks like Adam's family would live here or something. And he's like, hey, what do you think about us doing a song together? Do you like my stuff? And I was trying to think, and I go, I like this song, Little Red Book. And he goes, yeah, we should do something together. But I wasn't cool enough to like do that back then. I mean, and what we would have done would definitely not have sounded like what Elvis Costello did when he worked with him. And at another time before I think it was right after our first album came out or just before it,
mm-hmm.
It was freezing in Ohio. And Richard Branson called up and said, hey, how you guys doing? Do you want to come down to Jamaica? And I'm like, Jamaica? I've never been there. I've never been anywhere, warm, except, my dad had loaded my family into a station wagon and drove us all around Mexico a few times, and where we would just, once we got tired of driving, we'd stop, pitch a tent. The family would sleep in a tent on the side of the road in Mexico, and then we'd get back in and drive. And he picked all these places to take us to that were awesome. Bob Casale, that morning that he called, I woke up freezing in this living room of somebody's house. We didn't have homes anymore at this point in time. Mm-hmm. And Bob Casale was sleeping in what was like a greenhouse off of the living room. And the window had blown open during the night, and he was covered with snow, hiding under this cover. So when Richard called us and said, do you want to come down? Bob and I were ready to go. Jerry, I don't know why he didn't go. Bob Mothersbaugh and Alan Myers were wrapped up with some women that Bob Mothersbaugh was going to marry this woman eventually. And I think Alan, I think they were married already, but they were with their girls. And so Bob and Casale and I said, we'll come down. So we flew down to Kingston, and he took us to this hotel and I just remember, Richard saying something. I'll skip to the end. He said, well, Johnny Rotten's down here and he's in the next room and he wants to join Devo. If you guys want to go out onto the beach, we can make an announcement. I've flown in New Music Express Sounds and Melody Maker reporters that they'll take pictures of you guys shaking hands, and we'll talk about this new collaboration, because he had heard that we loved the Sex Pistols, which I did. And we saw them there last night that they played in San Francisco, and they came over to where Devo was staying, which was just some newspaper, Search and Destroy, their newspaper. We just slept on piles of Search and Destroy magazines because there weren't really beds in this place. I just remember looking at him. I said, well, maybe what Johnny should do is kind of, instead of being, like an anarchist, he should totally flip over and be a corporation. He should be Johnny Rotten Incorporated. And that's the last thing we talked about with that. And, there became,
public image. Yeah.
And,
wow.
So there's other people, I could say, Beefheart, I saw him rehearse a lot because he rehearsed at a house where one of the Go-Go's lived, and some other people, and that was near where I lived, so I could walk over there. Mm-hmm. And I watched them rehearse, and I just thought, I wouldn't want to be in his band because he told everybody what he wanted them to do, but he had no musical terminology. So he would like make movements, and he would yell at them, it was kind of sweet because they all were trying to do what they thought he wanted to do. And after he left, they'd be going, you didn't do a good job at all with that bass line. Yeah, that's not what he was looking for. And they go, you don't think so? And they go, but you're drumming. I think he liked what I was doing drumming. And it was kind of cute, but I don't know. So, I don't know. I guess there's probably people I'd love to work with.
Mm. Cool. So our next audience question comes from David Smith of Leeds, United Kingdom. And David asks, is it clear when a piece of work is finished? Is there a temptation to add another track or re-record a vocal? Are you typically satisfied when you say something is done?
Okay, here's my feeling about that.
Mm-hmm.
Our first albums, we'd written almost all of the songs while we were still performing live. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a way of writing music that I think really was good for Devo. I think it was like kind of the best way to write music for Devo. It was like, because we could try them out in clubs and then we changed things, we modified them. And it happened over, songs would have a couple of year gestation period instead of, like we just wrote an album, we got 3 weeks to record it, go, And there was a lot of stuff. Like even I remember hearing Whip It the first time I heard it in a club. I remember sitting there going, why did we use that hi-hat? We should have used the other one that was sitting there. That would have sounded so much better. I remember things like that. And we always, like were critical of our music, even to the point where when people started covering our stuff, I remember like hearing things and going, that's a good idea. I wish I would have thought of that, sometimes with some of the things, and it's like when you play live, though, afterwards, you have the ability to change it. Like if you listen to a live show that we've done in the last 10 years, and then listen to albums from 25 years ago or 30 years ago, mm-hmm. You'll hear changes. And I think the live stuff is almost 100% of the time superior to the records.
Hmm. Now, is there a specific film you wish you had been able to compose a soundtrack for? Like, for instance, a classic from a bygone day?
Well, I'm a big TCM fan. So, because what happens for me is like, I've done so many television shows and so many films, mm-hmm. I don't know, 175 different TV shows and films mixed together. And it's like, I go home at night and the last thing I want to do is like, I start watching a movie. Mm-hmm. I go, why did he use oboe there? That doesn't make sense. That's not strong. Or I'd say, why did that cue keep going on and on? That's irritating. I can't separate it. But when I watch black and white, somehow I go back into my childhood or even back into my 20s where I used to watch movies on black and white TV. Mm-hmm. And I can go into that state you go into when you watch a film, and it's much easier for me. So I watch old movies all the time, and I see all sorts of movies that I think could use a better score. And there's some that I just wish I would have been part of. It's like I have movies that are dear to me for the soundtrack. And I think Clockwork Orange, for instance, may have been one of the most impressive soundtracks to me. I thought that was so incredible. I love that. With modern films, yeah, there are, there's ones I wish I wanted to score. Idiocracy, for instance. And I thought for sure he would go, oh, Devo should be scoring Idiocracy. And he didn't.
Oh.
I wanted to score Back to the Future because Devo played this show at the Palace in Hollywood. Mm-hmm. And after the show, Steven Spielberg was there, and he came up with Robert Zemeckis, and they said, hey, Mark, we want to talk to you. We thought you guys are great. I want to talk to you about this movie we're doing. And I'd already been scoring things, so I was so excited. And he sent me the script, and I read it, and I thought, oh, this is great. This is perfect. I would love to score this film. And I got into his office, and they said, okay, I'll tell you what we want. We want you to be the character. There's a professor in this film, and we want you to be the professor in our movie. I go, no, you mean you want me to act? And he goes, yeah. And I go, oh, I don't know how to act. And he goes, no, we watched all those films that you were showing before you went on stage, and we watched you on stage. You're such a great performer, actor. I go, oh, I make that stuff up. I don't, that's not somebody else's stuff. Everything I do, I make up myself. And I just remember, and they just looked at me like I was crazy. And I left, and I just remember going, oh man, I thought they were going to ask me to score their film. And I remember being so disappointed. And
so you missed your chance to be Doc Brown, I guess.
Yeah.
Wow. Now, is there a composition you're most proud of, or is there one that's most indicative of the Mothersbaugh sound?
No, because you you change with life, and life brings all these different things to you. And I understand that a lot of artists are they do have a brand that's very recognizable as what they do.
Mhm.
Especially when I got into music, bands, they found a sound and they stuck with it. And Warner Brothers fought with us. They wanted us to stick with the sound.
Mhm.
And then when Whip It happened, they were all over us saying, "Hey, do anything you want on your next record. Just do another Whip It." Well, I gotta say, we didn't do that to be a pop song. So, I don't really how to accomplish that. But for me, it's like it would be a different song for different times. It's like when I was working with Wes Anderson
Mhm.
on this one film, Royal Tenenbaums, there was a scene in it where Angelica Houston and uh,
Gene Hackman?
thanks, yeah, Royal Tenenbaums. They're walking through Central Park, and it's long after everything's long done between them, and she's got a new boyfriend, Danny Glover, but she goes for this walk, and he's being, for the first time that since she's known him, he's being super complimentary. He's being really nice, and he's like noticing things, and he's like the way she wished he would have been, like 20 years earlier,
Mhm.
25 years. And but it's too late for it, but he doesn't recognize it. But so the music I wrote for that was kind of up, and it was optimistic. The next film, and Wes used to take music that I wrote. I'd write sketches just from reading the scripts, and
Mhm.
he'd wear headphones, and he'd listen to the music for timing out the shots that he was shooting. He would listen to the music for tempos and things like that, and energy, intensity. Yeah, when he worked on Life Aquatic, there's a scene where Bill Murray pops his head up into the screen. He says, "Let me tell you about my boat." And Bill Murray is like a loser version of Jacques Cousteau, and
Mhm.
and his ship. They haven't made any good movies, and he's kind of, it's funny, but he did keep the kitchen in tip-top shape, and the kitchen has all modern appliances, but like the sound man and the composer and the cameraman, they all have outmoded equipment. So he's going through the boat, and he's talking about it, in a really positive way. And Wes says, I want it to be something like when Angelica and Gene were in Central Park, you
Mhm.
know, that cue, scrapping and fighting. Wes renamed every cue I ever wrote, no matter how good the names were. He renamed every cue. That was one of his things because it was his movie,
Yeah.
and it was so great. But so he was playing scrapping and fighting while he was watching, while he was filming. Let me tell you about my boat. And so he said he wants something like that, and so I wrote him something, and then he like went, "Yeah, I like that, but it's not quite." It's not quite, as good as, like fighting and scrapping and fighting. And so then I wrote him something else,
Mhm.
did it again. And at that time in my life, I was making artwork I called Beautiful Mutants. And I was taking photographs. I started with my family and then people I knew, and then it broadened out. But I was taking photos, and I was like flipping them over so that you would have a perfectly symmetrical head.
Mhm.
I found out that when you do that, humans have every human, even you, there's a side of your head that when you make it symmetrical, you might look younger, cuter, like a really nice guy, happy,
Mhm.
angelic. Any of those kind of things might fit you. And the other side is going to be darker, brooding, maybe demonic, maybe monstrous. And it's interesting. I became really fascinated with that when I was living at home. So I was making this family of characters and putting them all over these rooms,
Mhm.
and I was splitting things like that and doing symmetry. I came back from writing music for Wes and him saying try it again, and I was thinking, what do I do? And he likes scrapping and fighting. And I took the sheet music for scrapping and fighting, and I held it up to a mirror to reverse it. I started playing it, and I said, "Wait a minute!" So I took that music and for scrapping and fighting, and I played it backwards and used the instruments instead of using the instruments from Scrapping and Fighting movie, from Royal Tenenbaums. I used the instruments I was using for Life Aquatic, and I rebuilt that so that it played forward. And I played it for him the next day, and he went, "That's it, Mark. That's perfect." And I was like, kind of like, do I tell him he already owns that music, or do I just wait till after we record it? So right now he loves it, so I don't want to do anything that.
Wow, that is genius. That is so genius.
It's just a wild thing that somehow worked out,
Oh, that's amazing. So I've got another audience question. This is from Michael Basil of Redding, California. And he asks, how has the progress of technology influenced how you've worked? And what impacts have you seen on your own compositions and career? And he goes on to give an example. For example, as we've gone from a small number of tracks on a single tape reel in a fairly small physical studio space to easily transferring 128 track studio quality recordings internationally with very little waiting, so how has that kind of inspired and how has it changed your performances?
Well, it's really changed everything in amazing ways, both good and bad. But it makes me at the end of the day go, this may be the best time ever for somebody to say, I want to be a composer, or I want to write music, because it's never been easier or more, it's never been more democratic. It used to be you had to write a song, somehow get a record company A&R person to hear it, and then they have to say, all right, we pick you to do an album, and that's how it used to be. And now, a kid can have an idea or just be playing around and then create something. And you don't even have to worry about a record company. You can just put it right on the internet, and you can have thousands of viewers, 100,000 viewers in no time for no money. And technology just has good and bad things. I mean, when Devo started, we had like a 4-track TAC amateur tape recorder, and we got used to recording on one instrument on each of the 4 tracks, or stereo mix for the drums, and maybe putting down a bass and a guitar. And then I'd mix those 4 down to 2 again. And then I'd have 2 open channels, and I'd put probably vocals and a lead instrument on it, and then mix that down. It was obviously more difficult, but that's what the Beatles did when they started off. And what I found out later is it forced you to make sure you recorded exactly what you wanted the first time. And once we started getting into multi-track, and then once, Pro Tools and computers got involved, then it got into this thing where like that bass doesn't sound exactly right. Well, put another one on top of it. And then, it's not there. Well, try one that's a little more staccato. And then you'd have this mush of bass sounds that none of them were the right bass sound, perfect bass sound. And same thing with synth sounds. You go, oh, that's not exactly, well, just double it, triple it, and guitars and everything. And so you had to learn to be careful. There was a long period of time that we overproduced stuff. I think there was a couple albums where you really hear it overproduced, and it was a learning curve. Now it's like I know better, and it's like I resist the temptation to put a 80-piece orchestra on something if I know that I can do it with a string quartet better.
I got 2 more questions for you. The first one is, do you ever look back on your career and body of work and kind of marvel at how things have played out?
I'm pretty lucky, I have to say that, because, when I started off in music, I never thought about being a film composer or a TV composer. I thought, no, I'm just, I was an artist, and I wasn't thinking about it in terms of money or terms of work or because I was used to like painting apartments to pay for my apartment, and then I would have the evening that I could go to the TAC 4-track and record. And I do marvel. I think I'm really lucky, because I just had the right set of elements that made me fit in at the right time. I came along at a time when the entertainment industry was shifting over from using all live players to they were interested in electronics. And I knew them well, and I'd written, I'd already had a little bit of experience because I wrote incidental music for Devo concerts, like music to play before or during the show, like even in our first video, the Chuck Statler film, I took and scored like the end of it, where I took a Beatles song and then ran it through a ring modulator and but it was Muzak to begin with, and it was kind of like this weird sci-fi Muzak by the time we got done. Somewhere early on, I don't even know if I think we'd done an album by then, and Dean Stockwell asked me to score an off-Broadway Ionesco play that was a one-man play that Russ Tamblyn acted in. So I scored that one-man play, and then Dean, his next project was directing a film for Neil Young called Human Highway, and he gave Neil Young my score from the play, and Neil listened to it, and they used that to be about half of the underscore for Human Highway, besides Devo performing in the. So I had a little bit of experience then with scoring by the time I did Pee-wee. So, but I just was, I was learning on the job, definitely, constantly. And, you say Rugrats, and Rugrats to me, I think of it I have really fond memories, because it was this guy, Gabor Chupo, who had, he was a Hungarian who was smuggled through in the trunk of a car across the Iron Curtain. And then he came all the way over to Hollywood to make films. And he paired up with Arlene Klosky. And they made this great combination together where he like made the Rugrats characters look like tumors and weird limbs that were kind of grotesque but cute at the same time. And she put the heart into the show. She worked on the story and made sure the story was heartfelt. And they were very complimentary in that way. And he called me up. He collected art music. He collected esoteric music, and he had found an album I'd done in Japan, because I used to go to Japan in the early mid 80s, and I would write music or produce art bands over there, like Plastics and Hajime Tachibana, people like that. And he heard this album I'd done with a label called Tokyo Radical Artists, and it was called Music for Insomniacs. And I put a gold metallic cassette and then a deck of cards that had photos on each card. That you could play cards till you fell asleep was the idea, was the concept.
Wow.
And so he said, hey, can I use one of those songs for the theme song for our show Rugrats? And I said, well, I've scored TV before. Can I see what you're doing? And I said, let me write you a new song. And so I wrote the theme song for Rugrats, and then that's how it started, and then scored the show. But what was really great about that show for me was like Nickelodeon had never done a feature yet. So they didn't know what Paramount, who was the company that was going to put out the movie, they didn't know what they knew. What Paramount knew was that don't hire a guy who's never scored an animation feature film with a full orchestra before. That's dangerous. But they were artists, and they went, no, he wrote all the music for our show. He's going to score our film. And so it freaked out the people over at Paramount. But somehow I had some people, including Bruce Fowler, who I think at one time he played with Zappa, but he was now like really into the world of scoring, and he was like one of the foremost brass players, and he offered to help me orchestrate my music. So when I wrote pieces out, he'd go, okay, Mark, now see, that lead line you have there? It's a flute, but right there at the C flat, it's going to turn into a piccolo. So we're gonna when I write the orchestration, the piccolo will be up here, the flute will be here, it'll work perfect. And, I had people that were orchestrators on that film that really helped me out. And by the time I went to record it in London, it's like I'd learned a lot.
Wow,
so that's and so Rugrats helped me. They helped me break through the catch-22, where before that I would only get to do films where it had like a small band, like Wes Anderson size bands, like 12 people, maybe 16 people playing. And so Rugrats broke through that door for me.
Oh, that's amazing. Because I often wonder, it's like, how do you, as a composer, as a symphonic composer, how do you determine like what instruments play what part of it? When somebody sits down and writes something out on a piano and then it suddenly becomes like 100-piece orchestra, it's like, how do you determine who gets what part of that musical pie? So, and I'm sure trying to learn that. But it's great that you had Bruce there as kind of to mentor you and kind of help you see, oh yeah, okay, flute, piccolo, okay, that's where I make that split.
Yeah, because I could read music, but I'd never written it out longhand.
Mm-hmm.
I'd always just used, in a band, you write down chords on a piece of paper, and then you show them to the band, and they all know what chords to play, and then you start talking about parts, and you don't really pass out sheet music per se. And then
Zappa.
Yeah, and then by the time I got into scoring, computers were there to save my life, and so I could write into software. Like I used something called Vision at the time that doesn't exist anymore, before Logic, and then it gave you a way to use your keyboard and go right into sheet music. You were like playing the notes onto the sheet music, so that's how I was allowed to get into that world. Because I didn't study it in school, and
it's amazing. That's amazing. So my last question for you is, what advice would you give to your younger self?
Well, in my case, I would say pay more attention to the business, because I was totally an artist and I made mistakes that the band became irritated with. Like because of me, we were on both Virgin Records in Europe and Warner Brothers Records in the US. You want to know why that sounded great to me? Besides, Richard Branson was the same age as us. I thought that was amazing because he sang the Sex Pistols and he put out Tubular Bells. But it's like I was just thinking that what was so great about it is that we're going to design one album cover for the US and a totally different one for England. That's so awesome. I get to design 2 album covers. And if we put out 2 singles, that means 4 single sleeves instead of just. And so I love the idea that we, because that was something that always fascinated me when I was a kid. If you got like a Beatles album in the US that was different than the Beatles album in England, and you'd be like, why did they do that? And then you'd have twice as much. You'd almost want to just like buy them. If you had the money, you'd buy them both so that you could like look at all of it to get all the clues and information to what was going on. So I stupidly got our band into a 2 label deal, and it cost us a lot of money at the end of the day.
Yeah, but when you're young.
But that would be, and the only other thing I would say is something I kind of did adhere to it, but I would give it to other people, is don't doubt your vision. Really, because there's so many people who want to destroy you that you don't even know it. They seem like they're your friends and they're not. There's so many reasons why you shouldn't be able to, recognize your vision or have it come out, and you got to just be strong, and that's hard for a lot of people. It's hard. I understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Mark, thank you so much for this time. I mean, what a treasure, and I really appreciate it. It's just fascinating. And like I said, you've had just a remarkable career. It's just been a real treat to sit down and hear you share these insights, and also some thoughts on like what other innovators and creators can take to heart, and what they can learn from. So thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, my pleasure. And if you want to do this again tomorrow, I'll probably have totally different answers for you.
Oh, excellent. We'll do part 2, the sequel.
You just asked the same question.